Hey Spice Heads, it's Ryan with Spiceworks. Thanks for hanging out with us. Today we have another Spiceworks partner webinar, Why Cloud Solutions Are Beating Traditional Antivirus, brought to you by Webroot. The first thing to check out is the question box on your screen. Please don't be shy, ask away. This is a great chance to get insight from pros. Questions will be answered at the end, and even if yours isn't answered, Webroot can follow up with you. The second thing to remember is that the webinar is being recorded. You'll get a link to that recording tomorrow, so if you miss anything, it's no problem. You and all your IT buddies can watch it later on. And finally, by attending, you have the chance to win a Samsung Galaxy Tab 3, courtesy of Webroot. Stick around because we'll announce that winner at the end of the presentation. That's all I got, so now on to the good stuff. I'll let our presenter, Grayson Milbourne, Security Intelligence Director for Webroot, take it from here.
All right, thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Spiceheads, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend my webinar. Today, what I really want to talk about is, first talking about why traditional antivirus solutions have failed, and I'm going to talk about this across the three different vectors for attack, those being traditional endpoint, mobile, and web. Or internet-based threats. I also want to talk a little bit about what makes Webroot unique in our approach to providing internet security and how we're very different from the traditional model. I'll take you through our Webroot Intelligence Network and some of the security services that we provide. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about MSPs and some of the troubles that MSPs have had. In fact, I have a few polling questions that I'll send out to the audience that can give me your perspective that I'll blend into the presentation. And then lastly, of course, we'll have a Q&A session. So let's go ahead and get started. The first slide I have here, just getting used to the interface. Okay, so I'd like to start off by really having an educational front to the presentation. And in that effect, I like to start off by looking at today's threat landscape so that everybody is informed and really understands why there was such a need to change the approach to the discovery of new threats and how you can host that discovery so that it can power all of the different types of solutions, whether that's endpoint, mobile, or web, all in one repository. And so I'll start here with the graph on the left here, and this is just taken from avtest.org, who is in the business of collecting malware samples and analyzing various products. And what this graph shows is they're some of what they call new malware, which is different from total malware, which is basically the collection of all of the samples they've ever received. What they realized is that they really needed to differentiate between variants of malware, so a one-to-many relationship, but it's all the same type of infection, to the total number. And so what this shows here is that, and you can really see if you look at it right around 2010, 2011, you can see that there wasn't a dramatic growth year over year in the new types of malware. And this is largely because the cybercriminal industry was redefining its approach on how it is able to distribute and release new variants of malware, knowing that the best way to defeat a signature-based solution is to truly overwhelm the collection ability for creating signatures, because the reality is that to create a signature type of detection, you have to have some sort of sample of that malicious code so that you can analyze it and create that signature. And so what we see today is that the vast majority of new infections are very short-lived before a completely new variant is released into the wild. And this, in effect, overwhelms the process, and it makes it unlikely that the AV vendors are going to successfully collect a sample so that they can then protect you from it. The target breach is a great example of this, to where very targeted tool was used to exploit that environment, and the AV in place was none the wiser, as they never had a chance to collect that type of sample. Additionally, a big problem today is that remediation doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. And the reason for this is that traditionally, when you analyze a new infection, the remediation of that infection all happens in the lab, and it's all really tied to the research process of understanding what that infection does. But what we see today is that malware authors are very well aware of this, and they develop code to actually detect research environments. They randomize, and they act uniquely based on the location that the infection infects. So it will do, so to speak, a geo-IP lookup, and then depending on what region that infection is, depends upon the behavior and the payload. And then lastly, signature-based detections really, they lack the necessary visibility to be effective. And my first stat here of 62% of breaches go unidentified for months or years really sums that up. And this number here came from a Verizon risk report that looked at well over 600 cases of corporate compromises and found that over 60% of the time the infection was still active in the environment months or even up to years after the initial compromise took place. And that again just speaks to the lack of visibility that most solutions have when it comes to identifying something that they maybe missed or something that's very new and targeted. So overall, traditional approaches are very slow to react, and in today's malware environment, being very quick to react is essential in preventing a major compromise. So on my next slide here, I have the other graph, which actually shows total malware. And again, this is from AV-Test. And so here you can kind of see that more year over year sort of doubling of the total number of samples that they're finding. But the number of variants that this is tied to is considerably less. And the other graph I have here shows the active websites versus the registered host names that exist on the internet. And this is tracked by a company called Netcraft. And really what this is meant to show is that there are many, many more host names that have been registered than there are actual active sites on the internet. And this massive number of difference here is explained by, again, cybercriminal activity, where the domain names are either pre-registered for command and control networks for many large botnets, but they're also pre-registered for phishing landing sites, for hosting sites for malicious content that has yet to be used. But in general, what we see here is that it's tools that have been generated for cybercriminals by cybercriminals that makes it very trivial and very easy for them to scale their operations. So much so that that's been their primary focus of attack for the last few years. And it's a very successful technique in defeating traditional discovery mechanisms, which rely on being able to discover these sites while they're still active. So my next slide here sort of takes the last two and sort of blends them together. But what I have on the left here is a chart by a company called Triumphant that was measuring the total number of malware signatures that were being created by the AV industry who has that traditional approach of releasing signature-based definition updates. And then I've superimposed that on the right with the new types of threats that are coming out. And you can clearly see that the strategy has successfully worked by the cybercriminals to overwhelm the signature creation process. And really here are some quotes that really back up my statement, really going back to 2010 where, Symantec was even saying that signature-based defenses are really useless in encounters with new malware. And the reality is that today almost all malware looks like new malware based on very clever coding techniques and polymorphic design, where it's nearly impossible to have a signature that can detect a zero-day piece of malware. And so, Webroot really understood this, and back in 2010 we took a dramatically different approach to how we discover our threats, and I'll go into that here in a few slides. So that kind of sums up some of the issues that we see with mobile. But I want to touch once more on remediation because remediation is a really big problem. I'm sure many on this call here are familiar with CryptoLocker. Certainly it's one of the biggest malware names that has come to recognition in the past 6 months or so. And at every MSP conference I've attended, it's certainly been one of the bigger headaches that people have had to deal with, largely because there's not effective remediation for that type of infection. What will happen is perhaps the endpoint solution might identify, that's the CryptoLocker executable, that's what caused all of the encryption, let's remove that from the system. But there's no solution for restoring the files that were encrypted. And so, that's one form of, ineffective remediation. And you have to have a plan in place for how you handle those types of infections. And so Webroot actually handles remediation very different from much of our competition. We use what we would call a journal and rollback approach to where, with CryptoLocker, for example, if we didn't outright block the infection up front and it made its way onto the system and began encrypting files, we have the solution where what we do is we monitor the changes made by unknown applications such that at a later time, if we identify something that's unknown to truly be malicious, that we have a journaled record of what it has changed on the system. And so that allows us actually to effectively roll back changes like encryption or file modification. But additionally, we see a lot of different techniques used in the wild to make remediation very difficult, depending on where it's installed. We see a lot of randomization, and we also see a lot of suppression of key malicious activity. And this is done for a few different reasons. One is that malware authors, again, are very well aware that there are researchers out there. There's companies like Webroot and the likes whose main responsibility is to identify these new threats. And with the given volume today, there's certainly a lot of automation that goes on in trying to flush out malicious behavior. But the reality is that with that volume, these automated systems have a very short time to live for analysis for each sample. And so a lot of times what we'll see is that the very first behavior is to do nothing, or to wait until you can confirm that the system is in fact is being used by a real user. And so we see things like looking for mouse movements and mouse click counts, and also application launching, and see what other applications are launched, whether it's a browser or Word or other commonly used applications. So in a short-term environment for analysis, oftentimes those triggers are not hit, and so the malicious behavior is never really flushed out. So these are some of the tactics that are currently being used. But again, you'll see shortly that these attempts at defeating the remediation process aren't very effective in Webroot's security environment. So that talks about endpoint there. Next, I would like to focus a little bit on mobile. Obviously, that's sort of the next platform. Many of us are, very attached to our smartphones, and for good reason. They're really designed to make our lives very convenient. But the reality is that they're really focusing maybe a little bit too much on convenience over security. And we're certainly seeing a boom in the types of malicious apps and also the types of attacks that really focus on mobile devices. And for good reason. These devices obviously contain considerably more data and information than our traditional endpoints. For example, I have my compromise analysis here, and I like to tell this story of, if I'm a thief and I've just perhaps stolen a traveling businessman's briefcase, and in there I got his laptop and I got his smartphone. Which of these devices is going to be easier for me to exploit and ultimately get to the data that I'm after? And so, when I think about the traditional endpoint, maybe I've got his Windows laptop, and to get onto that environment, I first need to log into his account, and so that already imposes a pretty decent challenge. There's probably a good password policy considering it's a corporate laptop. It has a domain-controlled password policy. Every 3 months it's going to update. And ultimately it's probably a longer password than I'm going to find on the mobile device, where we know from our own analysis that roughly 30% of smartphone users choose not to have any sort of lock screen or any initial authentication to gain access to the device. But in the cases where they do, it's oftentimes just a 4-digit PIN, or maybe less secure, a swipe type of screen. And so, from the thief's perspective, they're going to start with a mobile phone because it's very easy to gain initial access. So then again, with the phone, now that I've gotten past that initial very easy to defeat authentication, now I'm into the operating system of the phone, where again, it's really all designed around one-touch access to whatever service that I need. And so, most alarming in my perspective is that there's one-touch access into my email. So I don't have to log into my personal email account to maybe send a password reset notification. I might see, on this smartphone I have access to my Chase bank account. Well, thankfully most banking apps do require you to authenticate every time you launch them. But unfortunately they also have the option to say, hey, I forgot my password, and of course that password then goes straight to your email, where you don't need a password to access it. And so really all password resets that go through email become very trivial to defeat. Again, if you compare that to the traditional the traditional endpoint, the Windows-based laptop, sure, I can maybe, as a clever hacker, break through that initial domain credential. But once I'm onto the system, again, I might have access to the browser, where I could see maybe in the history which banks they use. But again, I'm going to have a more difficult time of breaking through the next layers of authentication. And so my point here is really that, mobile devices have a lot more access, they have a lot less security, and that creates a much higher risk for using these devices. And ultimately, it's definitely caught the attention of those in the cybercrime business. And as you'll see on my next slide here, this just looks at the number of increase of malicious apps that we found last year was over a tenfold increase in 2013. And one of the things that Webroot does unique in the space of mobile applications is that we have an approach that looks at more than just, hey, this application is bad or this application is good. We really aim to sort of fill in that gray area. And so what we've developed is what we call Android application reputation. And so the graph on the left here shows the breakdown of the various categories based on risk. So we have benign and trustworthy as the safest categories, but then it gets slightly more dangerous as we go into the moderate, suspicious, malicious, and unwanted categories. And this is just useful to, again, it sometimes can be implemented into an MDM solution, or it can allow you to set a policy for your BYOD users to say, okay, well, connect to our environment, but you can't have any apps that fall into a malicious, suspicious, moderate, or unknown category. And then on the right side here, we have a malware type distribution to sort of show, and this is sort of like the blown up malicious piece of the pie on the left. This is the distribution of what we see in the malicious category, where the vast majority, 80%, are potentially unwanted applications, and these are things that really have no true value, and they're really there just to collect data from your device. But Trojans make up a pretty big chunk as well, and these are types of applications that are looking to monetize through SMS sending or nowadays actually with the latest version of Android that actually notifies users before a premium rate SMS message goes out. The counter tactic to that we've discovered is that these apps are now are actually initiating premium rate phone calls, and so the phone doesn't prevent you from making that call. And then lastly, we have the spy phone and root types of applications, which again are quite concerning. Any type of app that roots your phone circumvents the traditional security that's on that device, whether that's permissions or MDM containerization. Once you've rooted the device, you really have sufficient access to break through those types of security measures. And so just to show how fast has this grown, this slide here kind of looks back over 2013 and shows the various risk-based groups in our app reputation service and shows the growth rate for those various groups. And so clearly, there's good app development going on, but the fastest growing group here unfortunately happens to be that of the malicious and unwanted categories. And in some cases, if you actually do the math here, the number of malicious apps is roughly over 20%, or between malicious and unwanted, it's close to 30%. And I don't want people to think that you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting a malicious app going to Google Play. The reality is that the legitimate app sources such as Google Play are very, very clean. We very rarely find malicious apps on those sources. It's much easier to find malicious apps on third-party markets or places that maybe are offering paid applications free of charge. So I always suggest to stay away from those types of app sources, but those are truly the hot spots for where we discover the vast majority of malicious mobile apps. So that's a good overview of mobile, but of course I also need to talk about the web, where most of these threats originate. And one of the really big challenges in discovering and classifying and protecting against these types of websites is that, as you can see in my lower graph here, this is what we call like the Longtail Dilemma, is that the sites that are the most dangerous are the sites that are also active on the internet for the shortest period of time. And again, this is very intentionally done, similar to the rapid release cycle of applications that are malicious. Having a very small window of visibility to your malicious web component, again, makes it very difficult to identify it. It happens actually at such a quick time that it's nearly impossible to actually crawl these sites predictively to be able to identify them and then update, say, like a blacklist to protect people from. And so the types of sites that we see in this group are your traditional spear phishing and targeted attack types of websites, as well as advanced persistent threat types of hosting infrastructure, often are not online for very long. And again, very, very effective mechanism to prevent the discovery of these types of websites altogether. In fact, in a lot of spear phishing or traditional phishing types of attacks, what we see is that the website is actually only online long enough to collect a threshold of credentials. And so they might have targeted a specific business, and they've sent out their dozen or so emails, and now they're going to wait. And once they have 5 people fall for it, they'll just pull the site, and so that its existence is no longer visible. Again, making it more difficult to know that the attack took place, and also the attack then still succeeded because it collected the credentials that it was after. So again, definitely makes it a very challenging environment to identify today's more sophisticated types of threats, but there's certainly a good solution in place. And then lastly, I did talk about phishing, but it's important to still mention phishing because it's still such a pervasive form of attack. Again, if we look at the target breach, from the looks of it, it looks like it was a spear phishing email that went out to an HVAC service that target used, and it was through that phishing email that the initial compromise took place. So again, having visibility and awareness of how phishing attacks work is very essential to having proper security today. And so, again, extremely effective, very rapidly growing still as a primary method of attack, is effective against any type of platform. So, we see actually a lot of phone or SMS-based phishing attacks go on today. And then the sites, like I mentioned, are online for a very short amount of time. And in 2013, we saw it shrink below 12 hours. In 2012, it was averaging around 13 to 14 hours. And now we're under 11 hours is the average online time for these types of websites. And then lastly, one of the things that makes phishing detection very, very challenging is that the sites are unidirectionally linked. And what that means is that to land on the phishing page itself, there's only one URL that takes you there, and that URL is not publicly referenced anywhere else on the internet. You couldn't Google for it. It really only exists in that initial targeted email that calls you to action to click on that one link. That's the only place that URL exists that takes you to that landing page. So again, very difficult to discover through traditional crawling of the web types of techniques. And you really have to understand who the target for these types of attack is and put the protection at the target level so that they can be the ones to first encounter, but also be able to first identify and protect against that type of site. And I'll actually take you through how our technology functions to protect against zero-hour phishing sites. So before I go into some of the things that make Webroot unique and talk about our intelligence network, I do have my first of 2 polling questions. And so I'll go ahead and launch this on the slide here, and I'll go ahead and read it to the audience as well. But I would appreciate if you would answer the question. And so the question is that, what is your primary consideration when selecting a security vendor to work with? And I have 6 different answers here. I have innovation, cost, peer reviews, a recognized brand, product support, and management in our features, our management interface or features. So I'll give you guys just a few seconds here to select your answers, and then on my next slide here I'll have the results of those. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move it to the next slide. And so here we can see that we really take positive peer reviews. That was, let's see, 30%. We also had the management interface and features at 36%. And cost and innovation following up with the 3rd and 4th place. And this is actually great for me to see. I like to see that people trust peer reviews. I think it's really important to understand what other use cases that are similar to yours, the experience in that scenario can be very telling. But also, innovation I think is really a key one. I think innovation is very important, at least to Webroot. We value that mentality very highly, and you'll see why on my next slide here. But lastly, management interface is also very important. You have to have something that's very easy to use, very intuitive, and that doesn't take a lot of extra effort in learning how to set it up. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about the paradigm shift that Webroot really embarked upon starting in 2010. And what I like to call this is collective cloud intelligence. And really what makes the Webroot Security Intelligence Network so unique is that First, it's hosted in our cloud, and so unlike the traditional model where endpoints receive updates from a definition file, maybe that definition might be hosted in the cloud, but the endpoints themselves are still responsible for digesting a definition type of file. We did away with this mentality completely, where today most devices are connected to the internet, especially if they're going to become infected. Chances are they're connected. And so the benefit to this is that as we identify new threats, we update that information in our cloud, and because all of our devices connect to our cloud, that instant or that detection or that classification is instantly distributed to all of our users. And so there's no lag or latency between us identifying a threat and that threat then being, or our endpoints or our solutions around the globe being able to protect against that type of threat. Another great benefit of this is that when you put all of your security intelligence into one bucket in the cloud, all of the platforms that you're protecting, whether that's mobile, PC, Mac, or our web gateway types of products, they all are pulling that data from that central repository, and so they're all capable of providing the same level of protection. That's a really big benefit, because the types of threats that we see today really do span all of these categories, and being able to identify a good use case example here would be we discovered some Android malware that downloaded some Windows-based malware on your Android phone, hoping that you would plug it in to your PC and that it would then infect your PC. So being able to identify threats of different natures on different devices is a great benefit. But then what's also really important about our approach is that all of our solutions actually feed our intelligence network. So when it comes to our data collection efforts or the discovery of new malicious threats, we discover these from our users and actually use our millions of endpoints around the world as the source of intelligence that goes into our cloud. And then it's our job to leverage big data analytics in our cloud. We have researchers that function around the globe in 24/7 manner, looking at this live feed of data generated from our users. And then we leverage a lot of advanced technology, ranging from good machine learning to popularity. And popularity is actually a good one to mention, because when you think about a collective intelligence approach, one of the benefits that we have is that we understand popularity very well. Having millions of endpoints reporting on data that they're encountering, the new applications and the likes, allows us to see which applications are being seen by lots of users. And so the good things end up colliding very rapidly in our cloud, and we see very large reporting counts for those types of applications. Now, when you think about what have malware authors been up to and how are they trying to change their applications to evade detection, well, they're using polymorphic design and rapid variant generation, and what that does is it creates very unique applications. And so when one of our users reports up a new file and says, hey, this is the new file I've just encountered, can you tell me about it? And we query our intelligence network and say, well, geez, we have hundreds of millions of file records, but we've never seen that one. And so that makes us very suspicious. And so we actually leverage popularity as a very important parameter to being able to discover the true intent of an application. And then ultimately what's useful about this is that when the endpoints act as the eyes and the ears, nothing really slips through the cracks. So if you're the single target of an advanced persistent threat, and the tools and the applications used to penetrate your network are designed for that attack, they're never going to have been experienced anywhere else. So there's no chance for a traditional signature-based solution to be able to proactively block that type of infection. Whereas with our model, we might not block it upfront and initially, but we'll at least have recognized that, hey, something new has come through, and in a very short order, our researchers in our working on the data in our cloud will have identified that threat, and the agent will then be able to remediate that infection. And then lastly, as I mentioned, remediation is really a core component of a security solution. Being able to identify a threat, but not being able to then remediate that threat, doesn't really solve the problem then, especially, maybe in the case of a ransomware, not reverting the files to a decrypted state doesn't really fully remediate that system. And so one of the things that we've developed a lot of innovation into is our ability to roll back system changes for remediation. And so every individual endpoint is responsible for recording the state of its environment and looking at changes that are made by new unknown applications. And so because we have such great awareness of what's good and what's bad, anything new that we see that's unknown is typically very suspicious to us. And so the agents are then responsible for recording any system changes that are made by an unknown application. Additionally, we know that no solution is ever 100% effective at blocking threats up front. So we have sophisticated security embedded in the application that we call our identity shield that really looks to neutralize an active infection. And the reality is that most infections today are really looking to scrape or collect data, whether it's point of sale data or your login credentials to your bank account or other online sites or online transactions. All of this is programmed into that Trojan to collect that data automatically. And so what our identity shield does is it looks at an unknown application, maybe a new zero-day point of sale piece of malware, and because we don't trust it and we can't make an instant classification for it, we actually then monitor its execution and we prevent it from touching any sensitive system data or anything that could lead to compromise of that system. So we protect the browser, we prevent any sort of keystroke logging or screen grabbing, and again, it's a good way to sort of neutralize the effect in that small window of time between where we've maybe first encountered something we've not seen before, in that window of time when we have made the classification in the cloud, and thus all users are then protected against that type of infection. So I know I've mentioned a lot here, but this next slide here sort of sums that all up into one good infographic. And so what we have here is basically the Webroot Intelligence Network. And I always like to start with this slide looking at the lower left with the millions of consumer and enterprise users, because again, that's the core feed of where we're deriving our intelligence, comes from the people who trust Webroot to protect their systems. So we're of great visibility and awareness based on millions of users contributing data. But we also have our traditional infrastructure and web crawling and content generation. We have a sensor network that looks for malicious IP addresses and also classifies web content. And then, Webroot was very much like a traditional antivirus company with a definition release model. And so we have a lot of that existing infrastructure still in place to, again, improve our awareness beyond what our users can contribute. But the reality is that what we see from our external threat feeds never, it's maybe 10 to 15% effective for what we actually see in the wild, and that what our users generate is actually a far better gauge of what infections are being encountered. And so basically all of this data sits in our cloud where it's then distributed to the various offerings that we have, which range from content classification to website reputation, IP reputation, file reputation. And then I did want to talk about the real-time anti-phishing because that's one of the new services that we brought to market this past year. And it's a great technology because, as I mentioned, one of the real challenges in detecting phishing sites is that they're online for such a short period of time that it's very difficult to identify them and then update a list to protect people from visiting that website. So what we've done is we created a system that can identify a website landing page that requests credentials. And then using some advanced machine learning technologies, we're able to pull metadata from that website, correlate that into our intelligence network, and make an identification with very, very good accuracy, high 90% accuracy, and identify that phishing site. So the use case could be, I'm the very first visitor to a just launched 0-hour phishing site, but because we have a real-time analysis system for discovery of these types of malicious web pages, we're able to respond back with, this is a phishing site and prevent the initial compromise from that user. So basically these different services are wrapped up and then are pushed out to our various products, whether that's our endpoint product, which leverages our file reputation and website reputation, our mobile products, which look at our app reputation and also the website reputation, or our web gateway products, which again have the web components there. And so Webroot's technology is trusted by many large organizations, ranging from Microsoft to F5 Networks, Facebook, and many others trust Webroot technology to enhance the security of their systems. So with that overview, I'm now going to launch my second polling question, and this one has more to do with the cost of providing security as a managed service. And so this is really more targeted to those of you who are resellers, MSPs, IT service providers who do provide endpoint security solutions. And the question is, which of the following is the most cost-intensive to your business? So the four options I have are endpoint deployment into a new environment, managing a deployed environment, dealing with manual remediation and or reimaging, or service-related calls to support the installed solution. So I'll go ahead and pause here for another 10 to 15 seconds and let my audience respond to the question, and then we'll review the results. All right, so let's go ahead and flip to the next one. Okay, great. And so this is often very accurate to what I guess when I ask this question. But dealing with manual remediation and reimaging stole the show on this one. Though followed up with 20% in endpoint deployment into a new environment. And so when I look at this and I say, these are probably two of the leading factors why a lot of MSPs might choose not to provide security solutions, because they can be very cost intensive and end up not turning a profit for the MSP. And I can certainly probably understand this dealing with manual remediation, especially with CryptoLocker becoming such a popular type of infection. So, with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other troubles that MSPs traditionally suffer with when making the decision to provide endpoint security solutions. But Webroot really does understand that it's very important to cater to MSPs to provide them with a very profitable, easy to manage, and effective type of solution. And so I'm not going to spend time reading through the various bullet points here, but these pretty much sum up a lot of the major concerns that we hear when talking to MSPs. But you have to maintain uptime. You have to ensure that the product does what it's supposed to do. It needs to provide security. It needs to be very easy to manage. That single pane of glass, one place to go to manage all of the infrastructure. It needs to be easy to deploy. And so let me talk a little bit more about some of these things here. So, profitability is obviously a very core component. If the solution isn't profitable, nobody wants to sell it or support it. And so, Webroot Secure Anywhere really does a good job of saving you both time and money. Our endpoints, because they're cloud-based, require no additional infrastructure, so there's no hardware to set up. There's no server to distribute updates. It's very easy to manage, all from any web browser. It's also ideal for mobile because if you have a mobile workforce, you have people who are very infrequently connecting to the corporate domain. So this sort of does away with all of the traditional headaches of ensuring that all of the endpoints are up to date. Deployment with our solution is as simple as installing an executable with a key code flag. There's actually a few different ways. You can even wrap the key code into the executable so it's just pushed out and executed. And then our cloud infrastructure actually takes care of the rest. And so there's all of the connection of the environment is handled in our cloud. And also one of the benefits to our approach is that our agents in the endpoint itself is extremely lightweight. And when I mean extremely lightweight, I really do mean that. For example, our endpoint installer is about 750 kilobytes. You could fit 3 of those on a traditional floppy disk. And that's not a downloading stub. It's just, we understand that the heavy lifting can really be done in our cloud, and so we've done everything we can to make the endpoint as slim and performance or non-performance impacting as possible. And so installed, we're looking at about 8 megabytes of RAM. Average scan times are about 1 minute to 2 minutes. And overall, the system impact is very, very tiny. We have some good analysis done by Passmark, who ranks our solution versus a number of other major antivirus that provides the same type of service, and we're many orders of magnitude faster than the competition. And this is because we really understand that having a security solution that's effective cannot impact the endpoint so that it cannot be used. we've done a lot of surveying, and what we found is that right after effectiveness of the solution, in second place, oftentimes MSPs were saying that usability is the second most important thing to them. And so, with our solution here, we have a very quick and easy way to deploy. We have a very non-impacting endpoint client, and because it leverages the Webroot Intelligence Network, it's extremely effective. And so, again, looking at the effective component, our intelligence network is truly one of the most powerful in the world. We're the leaders in developing this type of technology, and we really analyze our data in a big picture type of perspective where we can turn the tactics used by malware authors really against them, so that we can rapidly identify new threats, literally in real time, talking about seconds between a threat being first encountered by a user and it then being identified and protecting all of our users. As I mentioned, we have our identity shield that does a good job of neutralizing today's common threats. It prevents keyloggers from being effective, and it does a great job of covering that small space of exposure to an active threat and preventing that threat from doing any real damage. I talked a little bit about our real-time anti-phishing technology and how it's a very effective technique for identifying a brand new phishing page that was just launched. And the way our researchers work in identifying new files is that as new file data comes in, we're collecting dozens of components of metadata, ranging from the execution to the parent process and how that application got onto the system, and its popularity. And our researchers combine these parameters into unique file identification routines. And today we actually have closer to 400,000 of these predictive identification models that help us identify new applications automatically on both the malicious side of applications as well as legitimate types of applications. And then lastly, remediation is super important. Having the ability to identify something but not having the ability to actually fix it is a big problem. And so, we've made our endpoints each uniquely capable of understanding what system changes are made from an unknown application. And so, this goes from parent and child linking, so we can see payload linking, so we know maybe the initial file is a dropper, and it then installs the true infection. If we identify any component of the infection, because we have the linking ability, we can fully remediate with only identifying one component. And lastly, as I mentioned, reverses file modifications and encryption. And so this has been, it's been very frustrating that CryptoLocker has caused the damage that it has. But from Webroot's perspective, we've not had very many customers who suffered because of it, largely due to how we uniquely handle remediation. And on my last slide I have here, again, very easy to manage. We have a single pane of glass type of management interface that you can access from any internet browser. We have an Active Directory support and a group policy-based management infrastructure. So again, it's very, very intuitive, very simple to create new policies and new groups and new policies for those groups, and pretty much a drag and drop type of interface. And additionally, we have the ability to send agent commands. We hear this is often a very desired functionality, and so from the console, you can command individual endpoints across a variety of different commands. And then on our web security services, and right now we're in the process of integrating these two web interfaces into a single unified panel. But currently, our endpoint and mobile function in one panel, and our web security services function in another panel, but within the next few months here, we'll have both of those merged. But again, it's a very intuitive-based, web admin console. On the web security side of things, it's mostly around content classification and also prevention of malicious URLs and content. And so that's done across 83 different categories. Makes it very simple to select time ranges and or content that's acceptable. Again, mostly focused on the business side of things here. But yeah, so those are an overview of the various services that Webroot provides that are really focused more towards the MSP market. And I think at this point, I would like to go ahead and jump over to some of my questions here. We have a good number of questions that have come in, so let me go ahead and just start on these. Give me just a second, and I will start answering. Okay, so the first question here is that I've switched to Secure Anywhere, but how can I tell whether the program is effectively removing malware from my system? The last anti-malware program I used was notorious for giving false positives. So you can actually, we try to be very clear about what's been detected by the endpoint. So if we're talking about traditional Windows-based endpoints here, you can see what's been removed by looking into the quarantine. And we also, false positives are certainly a problem for many vendors, and it's something we take very seriously. But one of the benefits of our approach is that for false positives, we rarely run into a high volume false positive, which I would consider. Some of the other examples might be, Kaspersky last year released a definition update that detected a file in Windows XP, and it basically knocked Windows XP PCs off the internet. So all Kaspersky users on XP got knocked offline. We've never had a false positive of that magnitude, and largely the reason is that we leverage popularity to really inform us as to what applications are widely seen versus those which are not frequently seen. And so hopefully that answers your question. If not, please do chime in with another question. I can do a little bit better. It looks like we have a question about CryptoLocker. How about CryptoLocker infections? How does Webroot Secure Anywhere deal with these if unknown? Hopefully I've done a good job of explaining that, but just to give a more crystal clear explanation, what happens is when WSA first installs, again, I'm talking about Windows here with CryptoLocker. When we first install on a new endpoint, what happens is that the initial learning scan basically does an index of all application files on that system. And we basically build an index of these are the applications on this computer, and we query our cloud to understand which of these applications we know about versus which ones are unknown. So just for simple math, let's say there's 1,000 applications and we're aware of 900 of them. These remaining 100 unknown applications, we then start collecting additional metadata about those applications to see if we can shake out additional classification. So for those 100, say, we process additional metadata, and now we're down to 10 remaining unknown applications. So at this point, the endpoint, WSA Webroot Secure Anywhere, is responsible for monitoring those remaining 10 unknown applications and seeing if they ever execute. And if they do execute, to keep track of what changes they might make to the system, as well as preventing any sensitive data from being touched by the unknown application. So perhaps one of these unknowns would be a piece of CryptoLocker that we've yet to classify in our cloud, and it begins attempting to modify or begins encrypting all of the data on the system. And so we would be watching that encryption take place, taking byte for byte recording for what has changed across every file on the system. And so we would then correlate that behavior back to that application. And one of our researchers would see, hey, this is obviously malicious. This is CryptoLocker. He'll create a classification for that file, and then also create a predictive rule to identify any variants. And then the agent would receive, WSA would receive the update and say, hey, that application you were monitoring, well, we know it's now malicious, so you need to undo everything it's done. So at that point, WSA would say, okay, well, since I have this journal, I'm going to go ahead and kill and remove the application that I know is malicious, and I'm going to reference my journal to roll back any of the changes that were made by that application. And so we actually test this in lab multiple times a week to ensure that even with the latest variants of CryptoLocker, that we're successfully rolling back those changes. But we also have done a lot of work on proactively preventing this type of infection based on its very unique behavior pattern. So I'm glad to say with the latest variant that was just discovered late last week, we already have an agent out that can identify that behavior without any sort of file-based classification. So we're definitely staying on top of CryptoLocker, but even in the case where it does get through, we're very good at being able to roll back those changes. Another question came in that says, is the scan engine based on the Prevex cloud-based scanner that was purchased by Webroot? So Prevex is a company that Webroot acquired in 2010, and they were certainly one of the very first to look at a collective intelligence model where, what was unique to Prevex 3 was that it operated under this mentality of you have to put the endpoint first, and you have to see what your users are seeing. That's the best way to know what they are encountering, and it's the only way to ensure that you can protect them from what they've encountered. And so what Webroot has done since the acquisition of Prevex is we've really taken that model and we've enhanced it with our own technology. And so it's very different really from what Prevex had on the market at the time of Webroot's acquisition. But it takes that fundamental approach of putting the user first and collecting that data. And that's why I call it a collective intelligence model, because we really do see what all of our users see, and we leverage that in the discovery of new threats. So another question came in on CryptoLocker, and what would happen if CryptoLocker ran when offline? Would files still be unencrypted when returning back online? And so the answer here is yes. Being online or offline doesn't impact our ability to monitor what's going on in the system. Say, for example, we don't know what the application is because we can't check it with our cloud. In the case where we're offline, we treat every new application encounter as if it's unknown because we can't validate its state. So we'll actually treat things that we might be aware of as unknown until we can validate the state with our cloud. So once the internet connection was reestablished, any untrusted processes would be validated and corrective action would be taken. So we'd probably at that point identify CryptoLocker and then be able to roll back based on the local journal. So this next question came in, and it's focusing a little bit on mobile. It says, can we use a GPS locator when GPS is turned off on a smartphone? And so with the Webroot mobile app, you actually can change the state of the GPS setting. So even if it is off, we have a lot of what we call lost device protection or LDP features that allow you to remotely locate your device. So the phone could actually be on silent, and we can make it scream. The GPS could be turned off, but we can make the phone send you a message, an email with its GPS location. So that doesn't impact our ability to toggle those flips, or so those switches. Okay, so this next question I think has to do more with our web services, and so this one is, does this solution work as an external firewall, saying that traffic actually passes through externally, or does it need to be installed on all endpoints and they all need to be connected to the external servers? So for our web content classification services, it can work in two different ways. There can either be an endpoint agent that's installed that proxies the traffic, or it can actually be set up through a web browser-based proxy. But in any event, the traffic does go through us, where we validate the content based on our web classification service, and then pass back content based on the policy. Another question here is, in evaluating your service offerings, who are your competitors? So there's a number of competitors in the internet security space as far as providing endpoint and web and mobile protection. Many of them are the big names, Symantec, McAfee, Trend, Kaspersky, Sophos. I would say those are all some of the big brand competitors. But what really differentiates Webroot from these people is our approach and how we discover the threats that we provide to our users. And it's our collective intelligence approach. It's our behavioristic approach of being able to really see how our application is functioning in the wild. That's really what differentiates us from much of our competition, is that we have the real world perspective. And to that effect, it's been very effective for our customers. We certainly see it internally since we've made this migration in our customer satisfaction, in the number of customers who come to us with complaints about mist infections. Pretty much across the board, we saw a significant improvement in this new approach, and so we're very proud of it. So here, another question came in asking, can Webroot block DVD-ROMs and USB access? And so certainly, we look at these as two different vectors for new file arrival. And so certainly, USB sticks have caused many infections in the past. And so a good question that often comes up is, so Webroot, you're offline, I've plugged a USB stick in, how is Webroot going to protect me from a USB virus that might be present? And so, again, it's the same approach of, since we're offline, we just inherently don't trust anything. So if a USB drive is plugged in and a new application comes onto the system, because we can't validate it, we're going to, again, monitor its execution and record anything that it changes. And then once internet connection is established, we have an outbound firewall. So, of course, we're going to prevent an untrusted application from making any sort of outbound connection. And also at that same time, we'll try to validate it with our cloud, where we can likely make a classification at that point. So another question came in. So what is the resource impact for sorting or transmitting current state of mobile devices for rollback remediation? So on mobile devices, we actually don't have a rollback solution because of how the Android operating system functions. But the overall, so with apps, it's really just removing the APK from the system. It's typically always going to be a malicious APK. So we just uninstall the application. There's really not a need to have the same type of rollback functionality for mobile. But as far as the resource impact, it's actually very small. We understand, especially on the mobile side of things, that battery impact is a really big deal. And any time that you're using the processor, you're also using the battery. So we have a very small footprint there. Again, we leverage the cloud to make the lookups, and so we're really looking at initial hashes of APKs to see if we're aware of the actual application itself. And then in cases where we're not aware of the actual hash of the application, we then collect additional metadata that allows us to detect variants of known malicious applications. But in general, it's a very small quantity of data, very, very light on the impact of battery side of things. So here's another question that came in. It says, can you explain why it takes Viper 45 minutes to 2 hours to fully scan a computer, but Webroot only takes 1 to 2 minutes? Are all files being scanned in this 1 to 2 minutes? And so again, the answer here is yes. I mean, we are absolutely scanning all of the files. Some of the differences between our approach and, say, Viper is that what Viper does is when it scans files and it sees executables, if it doesn't make a signature-based classification, it'll attempt to emulate the execution of those files to see if a signature might hit while it's being emulated in their sandbox. And so this is one of the reasons that traditional AVs scan so slowly, is because they're doing this per file emulation process. So we don't do that. Instead, what we choose to do is we say, well, if something is going to choose to launch, we're going to launch alongside it, and we're going to monitor its execution events, at which point we can also potentially make an additional classification. But it also allows us to have a very quick scan time because we're not doing per file emulation during the scan. So the next question came in saying, do you track or report on bandwidth utilization for the endpoints? And we've done some studies on this to see, what is the weekly bandwidth impact. Because again, we are a cloud-based model. We do need to send data and connect. So there is certainly bandwidth usage. But what we found is that for the average user on a weekly basis, it's about 2 megabytes worth of traffic. But I always compare that to a definition-based model where oftentimes definition updates are larger than 2 megabytes. And so there's no point, or there's no push across the network to distribute these. Again, it's each individual endpoint just validating new application encounters. And so, that's an average user who's maybe encountering a number of new files every week. But on a server, for example, where there's very little file turnover, it would be considerably less. Let me just read this next one here. So, sorry, just give me another second to read these. So this one is a good question about keyloggers, and it says, can any keylogger go undetected or sit dormant and come to life months down the road? And so the answer to this is it certainly could be. I wouldn't necessarily say months down the road, but often what happens is that they will, an infection will come onto a system and it will wait for a trigger event for that keylogging to take place. And also when I talk about keyloggers, they really fall into 2 categories. There's commercial keyloggers, which are applications you can buy on the internet that are developed for that intent and purpose. And there's also what I call black hat keyloggers, which are available on underground markets, and it's more often code that goes into an application like a Trojan that has the ability to record keystrokes, but it can also take screenshots, and it also looks to record any financial transaction. But this type of thing could happen. On the commercial keylogger side of things, you can set a schedule for when it should and shouldn't record. So it makes sense to say that you could have it recording only on Sundays at 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock. But it really depends on the configuration of that keylogger. Okay, a great question came here that I often get asked, and this has to do with the journaling. And so does the journaling need significant disk space? For instance, we have many laptops with SSDs that really don't have a lot of extra disk space. So the way that we handle journaling is as intelligent as possible. And so when we say see a modification to a file, we're only tracking the bytes that were modified in that file. So it does have a limit to the physical space on the disk, but what we find is that in the vast majority of cases, our journals never really break the 1 gigabyte mark. I've seen a couple cases where they've gotten to that size, but it's typically been on developers' PCs where there's many new applications being developed and tested. But in most cases, even a gigabyte, there's normally at least a gigabyte extra disk space. But for most people who don't encounter or aren't like a developer, the average size is considerably smaller. But it does depend on what's being recorded and what's being journaled. But it's done in a very smart way to utilize as little disk space as possible. But it is dependent on total disk space available.
And Grayson, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but I think we just about have to wrap it up, and I want to make sure we get to announce the winner.
Okay.
Again, you'll get the chance to follow up. Webroot will get the chance to follow up. So even while I'm announcing this winner, attendees can still submit questions. But now for the grand prize winner, very lucky person because it's supposed to be a very cool prize. We have Ryan Schuster, and apologies if I mispronounced that name, but that's Ryan Schuster. So Webroot will reach out to you. But congratulations. And just again, a thanks to Grayson for such a great presentation. We had a ton of questions. And I'm just going to throw it back to Grayson for just some final closing words.
All right. Yeah, great, Ryan. I appreciate that. So there was a couple of questions I didn't get to. One really quick, registry rollback. Yes, we do roll back the registry. But I really just want to say thank you to everybody who had a chance to or who took their time to attend my webinar. And, of course, I will do my best to answer any questions that I missed. And feel free to reach out to me directly with any other follow-ups as well, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation. So, again, thank you, everyone.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. And you will get a link to the recording tomorrow so you can check it out again, or in case you had to step out, you'll be able to see what you missed. But thanks, everybody, and have a great day.